has been called a psychology of self and will. And as we'll see, self and will are two of the key concepts in this framework. So this is just a little overview of what's in the presentation, the origins and overview of psychosynthesis, dimensions of consciousness, aspects of will, stages of awakening, implications and applications of psychosynthesis, and then how this relates to soulful leadership. So a fair bit in there. There he is, Roberto Assagioli, the founder of Psychosynthesis. And this is a quote from him: "Humans must, for optimal health, consider the spiritual realms as well as the psychodynamic ones." And that's in a way the kind of founding
I can see
principle.
your slides you're describing.
Sorry, you can't see my slides?
No, it's just me. You can. Okay, maybe it's just me. Then
Yeah, I'm able to see them.
you can.
Yeah, I can see as well.
Literally just me then. I'll shut up.
Oh, I wonder what's going on with that.
It'll be
Is
like
it maybe
Devon
your
Wi-Fi.
view? Because I'm sharing my screen, so
Yeah, it's not me.
Yeah, maybe it's
There you
your
go.
view.
I'm good. I'm good. User error. Sorry.
that's okay. Perhaps you're spotlighting me or something.
No, I was on another tab that said meeting. So yeah, sorry. Ignore me.
Aha, yes, you can switch between them now.
Yeah, I inadvertently hit that one. Yeah. Now I see.
Okay.
I see the guy. Yeah. Sorry about that, guys.
No worries. Okay. Good. Well, glad everyone else can see. So we get to gaze upon Roberto Assagioli. Humans must, for optimal health, consider the spiritual realms as well as the psychodynamic ones. And so, yeah, this is the kind of beginning principle of psychosynthesis, because as we'll see, yes, it was developed by Roberto Assagioli, who was one of the first psychoanalysts, and he was working alongside Freud. So as it says here, it was created as an evolution of psychoanalysis, addressing what Assagioli saw as the limitations in Freud's approach by including spiritual and transpersonal dimensions. So essentially Freud, quite a lot of the key players in the founding of psychology, Freud, Jung, Maslow, and Assagioli, were all contemporaries, and they were in dialogue with each other. And Roberto Assagioli was a student of Freud's, but he felt that Freud's psychology only dealt with what's called the psychodynamic aspects and didn't include a spiritual view of the human being. And so that's his response, was to create psychosynthesis, which is like an integrative and holistic psychology that takes into account the whole human being, including their spiritual and soulful dimensions. So it says, established as a comprehensive theory of human development that integrates psychological and spiritual elements. The foundational principle is that humans naturally tend towards growth, integration, and self-actualization, in the same way that we see those principles in the natural world, right? Growth and integration and synthesis. The core concept of the egg diagram, which we'll show you shortly, shows that there's multiple levels or dimensions of consciousness, including lower, middle, and higher unconsciousness. And yeah, one of the key contributions of psychosynthesis is Assagioli's focus on will as a central psychological function that guides personal growth and transformation. It gained international recognition in the 60s with the publishing of Assagioli's first book, Psychosynthesis, and it influenced the development of humanistic and transpersonal psychology movements. So it was really right there at the beginning, alongside Abraham Maslow, in thinking about concepts such as human potential and self-actualization. And psychosynthesis, one of the things that I think is so compelling about it is that it is a living system. Because of its nature, it actually invites evolution, and it continues to evolve through various institutes worldwide, some of which we've named. And its primary application so far has been in kind of like psychotherapy and personal development, but it also has applications to like all sorts of other things in terms of how we relate. So in terms of consciousness, there's a few different concepts. Here it is, the egg diagram. This is the central model of consciousness in psychosynthesis. And as you can see, it's an egg shape. And in the middle is a smaller egg, which is the field of consciousness. So the bigger egg around it is the field of unconscious. And as you can see, that's divided into the lower unconscious, the middle unconscious, and the superconscious, or the higher unconscious. So the field of consciousness is everything that we are aware of in the moment, right? So everything that we currently have in our minds. The middle unconscious is things that, you know, they're not in your mind right now, but you could recall them, you could bring them to mind. The lower unconscious is more things that are denied and repressed. And the superconscious is often the things that are untapped. So yeah, as you can see, we also differentiate in various psychological thinking between pre-personal, personal, and transpersonal. So pre-personal being related to the lower unconscious and what is denied and repressed, personal being related to the middle unconscious, and transpersonal being related to the higher unconscious or superconscious. And this is essentially about personal, like the development of the personality is also kind of the development of the ego, our self that manages reality. And the pre-personal is generally material that has come up in our younger life that hasn't been resolved, right? So it's not integrated into the personality. And the transpersonal is that which is actually as yet beyond our personality, not yet integrated, you know, creative and intuitive faculties. So this is kind of an interesting quote from Assagioli that he wrote in a letter. He said, I'm interested, Freud had said, I'm interested only in the basement of the human being, by which he means the lower unconscious. So a lot of Freudian work and what we call psychodynamic work is all about the resolution of our unconscious material in the lower unconscious. So Freudian analysis will be dealing with that. And in contrast to Freud's assertion, I'm interested only in the basement of the human being, Assagioli wrote, psychosynthesis is interested in the whole building. We try to build an elevator which will allow a person to access every level of his personality. After all, a building with only a basement is very limited. We want to open up the terrace where you can sunbathe or look at the stars. So, of course, in this analogy, the terrace would be the superconscious, where you're gazing upon the self, the star of self, as it also is presented in the diagram. And self is, in a way, hard to define, but the thing that we could relate it to is spirit, life force, yeah? That which imbues everything, the animating principle, which also animates us. So we are connected to that principle. And part of the work in psychosynthesis psychology is about establishing what we call the I-self connection. So the I is our center of identity. It's what we identify with when we say, I am this, I am that. And what we're doing as we kind of expand or develop our field of consciousness is we're just gradually expanding this field of consciousness to include more of what's in the unconscious in every direction. And when we include what's in our lower unconscious, it's no longer kind of creating difficulties for us in our lives. And when we include what's in our superconscious, that means that we have more access to our kind of creative and intuitive capacities. So central to psychosynthesis is building the I-self connection, which is the ground of being through which we can access a sense of intuition, creativity, purpose, and will, which we'll get into shortly, but essentially life force. yeah, just very kind of simple diagram expressing the different dimensions of being, which is one of the great contributions of psychosynthesis. So as we kind of went through in the meditation, we have, of course, a body, feelings, and mind. And a lot of the time, our awareness will be in one of those places, body, feelings, and mind. For many of us, we're mainly mind identified with thinking a lot, thinking a lot, thinking a lot. Now, when we have self, which is what we might call the witnessing presence, which is, of course, what a lot of spiritual practice is focused on developing, we kind of create this whole other dimension. So we're no longer just in a flat land of the triangle of body, mind, emotions, and maybe just reacting to that. But there's another dimension of this witnessing presence of self that is actually able to then notice and perhaps regulate. So the point is there's different dimensions of awareness and consciousness. Now, again, from Assagioli, the basic purpose of psychosynthesis is to release the energies of the self. So the self being the star at the top of the egg diagram. Prior to this, the purpose is to help integrate or synthesize the individual around a personal self, and then later to effect the synthesis between personal ego and self. So it's a bit of a wordy sentence, but essentially what he's saying is that there's two levels of synthesis. So I'll go back to the egg. The first is personal synthesis, which is about synthesizing different aspects that are in the unconscious around this center. And then the second is transpersonal synthesis, which is about synthesizing the personal self with self big S, the transpersonal self or the superconscious, so the animating force of existence. Now, part of the work in personal synthesis is about creating resolution between parts in our unconscious. So this is, looks like a bullseye, doesn't it? A very simple kind of diagram related to what we call in psychosynthesis sub-personalities. So within the egg would be dotted with sub-personalities, which have been developed in response to difficulty, mainly in early life. And each sub-personality has an external behavior. It's like explicit or ostensible want, and a deeper need that it's trying to fulfill, and it represents a quality of unconditional love. And I'm not going to go too deeply into that, but the point is that we have these aspects of self that are survival strategies that are created in response to compensating for an unmet need. The way that they go about trying to fulfill that need often doesn't actually fulfill it, and therefore that's when we can get quite lost, because we develop a personality that isn't actually in tune with our deeper selves. So all these little sub-personalities together form what we call the survival personality. And this is Joan Evans from the Institute of Psychosynthesis. She's talking about the false self, which is also the adapted self or the survival personality. And she says the purpose of the false self is not adaptive but defensive. It protects against painful feelings. In other words, the false self does not set out to master reality, but to avoid painful feelings, a goal it achieves at the cost of mastering reality. So the point is that our defense mechanisms, our compensation strategies are designed to protect us, so that we can avoid pain. But in doing that, they actually shelter us from meeting life vulnerably and openly. So we use this language of the survival personality in psychosynthesis to talk about like the weaving of the different sub-personalities and defense mechanisms. And as I said, it develops in response to our environment in early life and our efforts to get our needs met. It's not bad, but it can become limiting as these survival strategies outlive the context that they developed in. And so they stop us from being able to meet reality. And we get stuck in life when we think that our survival personality is who we are. We think that the way that we're pursuing our kind of compulsive needs and desires is the basis of our identity. And actually, there's something else at the core of us that is wanting to be met and expressed. So we might call that thing our soul. And yeah, this is just a kind of little way of expressing the difference between how the survival personality meets life versus how the soul wants to express. So the survival personality is motivated to survive, driven by fear. It has a will to protect and defend. It needs validation. It's defensive and reactive, rigid and rooted in history. Yeah, it's actually a product of a past reality that is now still running in presence. It's socialized and conformist, and socialized meaning kind of conditioned, and conformist, it wants to fit in, and is generally desiring control and approval and security. So wanting, safety seems to come through control and approval and security. That's the kind of basis of how it performs. The soul has very different motivations. It's motivated to experience, moved by desire. It has a will to connect. It needs to express itself. It's agile and able to respond to the needs of the time. It's ever emerging and evolving, synergistic and authentic, and hungry for truth, beauty, freedom, and love. So what's often happening is that our soul's appetites for truth, beauty, freedom, and love, our soul's desire to emerge and express, is being blocked by our survival personality's need for safety, and strategy to defend and protect, and through creating kind of control and predictability and security. And it's when the soul's emergence starts to become really uncomfortable that we start to experience kind of crises of meaning in our lives, which we'll get into in a bit. So the other big contribution of psychosynthesis is around will. And Assagioli has kind of defined lots of different aspects of the will. He says, the first stage is the recognition that the will exists. The second concerns the realization of having a will. The third phase is that of being a will. He perceives that he is a living subject endowed with the power to choose, to relate, to bring about changes in his own personality, in others, in circumstances. So recognizing that, yeah, we have will to create. We can create our lives. We're not a victim. And this is one of Assagioli's, another kind of key model in psychosynthesis, related to the psychological functions, which are these 6: imagination, intuition, thought, impulse, desire, sensation, and feeling. And all of these, in a way, are like ways that we meet life, and we've got self in the center and will as well. And then these psychological functions can be thought to relate to what he's also identified as different types of will. Now, the types of will that he outlines in his book are strong will, skillful will, good will, and transpersonal will. And since then, in terms of related to the psychological functions outlined here, somebody else has added grounded will and creative will, because they match quite well these other functions. So just explain a bit about the different types of will. Strong will is kind of maybe what we kind of classically associate with will. It's like, I'm going to get it done, determination, like maybe even kind of brute force, you know, like this will happen. And we really go for something. Determination, perseverance, strong will. Skillful will, very different. Less about effort and force and pushing, more about, of course, skill, analysis, strategy. It's much more, yeah, it's related to thought. So it's about complexity. How do I get this thing done in a way maybe where I don't have to push, you know? And yeah, being skillful in the kind of tools that we might employ. Like if maybe these days we might use AI to help us to like meet a task, right? That would be employing skillful will. So awareness of different tools and the complexities that can help us to create strategies to manifest something. Goodwill, very different again. Goodwill is all about relationships. Yeah. So like, how can I get someone to help me to do this? Some people are very good at cultivating goodwill. Like people just always want to help them out, you know, maybe they're always helping other people out. So they know that they've got support. So goodwill is all about that thing of like, it's easier to do things together, right? Many hands make light work. So how do we get people on side so that they want to help us? And then transpersonal will, very different. Again, transpersonal will is about how do we tap in to life force, the will, the creative will of the universe, that will that is beyond us, that will that made us. How is it possible to tap into that? And of course, in this model, it's saying, well, intuition might be a way that we connect to a will beyond our own personal will. And the suggestion here is that there's also creative will, which is about employing the imaginative faculties, you know, maybe visioning, and yeah, this kind of classic more manifestation, but having the creativity as well to kind of, yeah, think of new possibilities. And then grounded will, I think, might be about how do we actually hold processes of change? How do we remain able to, yeah, maintain change, to create a ground of being in ourselves that has the capacity to keep going, perseverance in a kind of steady way, rather than the like pushing strong way. And so what Assagioli is saying is that any act of will actually requires all of these psychological functions to be on board. And if we can learn to employ them equally, then that is the success to making things happen. And what we might find is that many of us focus a lot more on certain psychological functions and are maybe neglecting others. So what would it be like if there's something in your life that you're wanting to make happen? Maybe you're thinking about it a lot. Maybe you're thinking about strategies for it. What would it be like to imagine possibilities or tune into intuition or sensation and feeling? How does this feel? How does that feel? So all of these psychological functions are, in a way, they're ways of sensing, they're ways of knowing. It's not just thought that is a way of knowing. Sensation is a way of knowing. All of them contain information. And what he's saying is actually all of them are equally important. And that's what makes psychosynthesis quite interesting as a psychology, is there is an emphasis, you know, looking at the body, feelings, mind, on sensation and on somatics, as well as on, you know, imagination and vision. so that we're not just processing everything at the level of analysis and thought, which is what a lot of psychodynamic stuff is about, but yeah, employing other ways of knowing. And Assagioli was actually like one of the founders of the first school of like psychosomatics. So he was really into the wisdom of the body as well, which is obviously, yeah, here. Another quote from him about will: we live in the in-breath and the out-breath, an integral part of our universe, taking in and giving back. And the will, functioning as our out-breath, allows us to know ourselves in the world, to have and be conscious of our impact, and to responsibly claim the power to create. I think that's beautiful, to responsibly claim the power to create. So one of the kind of key things in psychosynthesis is this idea of, you know, as above, so below, that we are nature and that we can understand things at different levels. So when he's using this analogy of the in-breath and the out-breath, in the same way that we breathe and we take in and then we release through the breath, we also reflect internally and express. And so when we're thinking about consciousness, we're thinking more about our internal world. When we did the meditation, turning our gaze inwards, reflecting, developing our field of awareness, so that, yeah, we're aware of more and more, bringing the unconscious into consciousness. So that's the kind of in-breath, as it were, self-reflection, self-awareness. And the out-breath is the will, how we actually contribute to life, how we meet life, how we express. And so another model, this is the stages of will. And yeah, it kind of goes, as you can see, there's different levels. And I've got the arrows here. So purpose, meaning, values, intention, deliberation, choice, affirmation, planning, and execution. And so this is actually just a really great practical tool. If you're wanting to create something, you can think about, okay, have I looked at all of these dimensions and stages of will? And we can relate them in terms of the philosophy of psychosynthesis to those dimensions that we've already been exploring of transpersonal, personal, and the kind of material, or spirit, consciousness, and form, different ways of saying the same thing. So at the level of the transpersonal, there's something more existential in a way. Purpose, why? Why am I doing this? Why does it matter to me? What's the point? Yeah. It's really important to know this if we're going to follow something through. Okay. Intention, deliberation, choice is about kind of more at the personal level. Okay, what does this mean to me? Is it the right thing for me? And like, am I going to commit to action? Choice is all about committing to action. And then we're following through at the material level, right? Okay, affirmation, yes, this is the choice, planning and execution. So often people are getting stuck on this somewhere, and it can be around here. You know, in my work with people, coaching, which I'll get into that in a bit later, but often people are either stuck here, where they're actually doing a lot of action, but they don't know why. They're really disconnected from all this. They're just like, okay, I'm just on the treadmill, I'm just doing it. And otherwise, people can also get stuck up here, not following through. Oh, I know the why, I know my why. I'm really connected to the bigger picture of life, and like I'm really connected to meaning. But I'm actually I'm struggling to follow that through and understand what it means for me and how I take action on that meaning in my life. So this takes us on to the stages of awakening. And you'll see how it's related shortly. So Assagioli has outlined different stages in the process of awakening, or what he also calls spiritual emergence. The crisis preceding awakening, which is when life lacks meaning, it's lackluster, it's boring, maybe there's a sense of nihilism. The crisis of awakening, which is when a spiritual awakening happens and everything is different and it's very disruptive, and you actually maybe don't know how to navigate life in the same way again. Reactions to awakening is what's happening psychologically when this experience of spiritual emergence has happened, and perhaps it's hard to reconcile with existence, and so then we can come up with psychological strategies in order to try and find a ground, and that can be things like inflation and what we call mystic flight on one hand, which is kind of like spiritual bypassing, or denial and suppression. So actually things just get pushed away because it doesn't fit into the current frame of reality that the person has. So it's defended against by pushing away. And then ideally what comes is integration. So that's what I was saying in the beginning. I found psychosynthesis was really helpful for me, was actually integrating all the different experiences. So this is kind of some of the symptoms, as it were, of those different crises, as they're named. And as you can imagine, crisis preceding awakening, there's aridity, spiritual aridity, boredom, depression, meaninglessness. And repression of the sublime is the kind of denial of beauty and the more existential or superconscious realms. Crisis of awakening can be terror, and can be kind of extreme emotion, like instability, essentially, in its most extreme case, psychosis, but otherwise just, yeah, overwhelm and not quite knowing how to kind of be grounded. Reactions to awakening, as already mentioned, inflation, idealism, fanaticism, splitting. This is when it's really hard to reconcile the awakening with life. So someone might kind of fly off rather than trying to weave together the different experiences. And when we integrate, there's a sense of coming down to earth. We might be resolving some psychological material that's stirred, and there's a humility, and even an ordinariness rather than the inflation that can happen when someone kind of has a spiritual awakening and then they think they know the answer and they've met God and they're the savior, and all of that can happen as part of a journey of spiritual emergence. And it's not saying that any of these are necessarily wrong or bad, but it's just acknowledging that these are potentially things that emerge on a journey of spiritual emergence, and that they can be emergencies, that emergence also creates emergencies, and that they need to be met well in order for integration to happen. So it's a funny little graph here, but it's basically saying there's some different kind of lines of development in this journey of spiritual emergence. One of them along the horizontal, the kind of ground, is, self-actualization, which you have probably heard of, which is much more about like material reality and the development of the personality and what we might call even the ego. So actually mastering reality at that level, becoming a well-functioning individual that, has a job and has a relationship and all of these stuff that we consider to be being kind of well adjusted, as it were. But what can happen along the way as a person dedicates their existence to those things is some of the symptoms of the crisis preceding awakening: aridity, meaninglessness, and we call this a crisis of meaning. So the classic thing, and it is quite common, someone's got the job, they're in the marriage, they've got kids, they've got everything that they thought they wanted, and actually they don't know what it's for. They just, what's the point, right? There's got to be something more. We used to kind of classically relate this to midlife crisis, but actually it can happen at any time. So yeah, a crisis of meaning is when life is lacking meaning. On the other hand, what can also happen is someone's on this journey of kind of self-realization, and they're engaging more in the transpersonal realms. So you might call them transcenders. And they might be exploring altered states of consciousness through meditation, through somatic practices, through eros, through entheogens, and they have it, and maybe one or multiple experiences of awakening, and in their journey of spiritual emergence, they experience a crisis of duality, which is to say, they've tasted oneness or spirit or Godhead or whatever it is. They've seen the light, they've all of these things, and then they still have to exist in the world, as we all do, right? And do the washing up and take the bins out and be in relationship to their in-laws and all the rest of it. And it's incredibly difficult to reconcile that. So we call that a crisis of duality, which is about kind of splitting. So just to, kind of clarify those, the crisis of meaning, typically experienced by actualizers when they reach a point of personal doubt, meaningless or spiritual aridity in the previously driven, unquestioned or confident lives. I'm a competent person, I've got the job, I've got everything I need, and then suddenly, actually, what's it all for? And the crisis of duality, typically experienced by transcenders when they return from spiritual exploration or experiences of self-realization to find the real world too painful or difficult to deal with. Okay. So those are some of the key concepts in psychosynthesis. And we'll think about just summarizing and taking them forward into how we work with them. So you are a center of pure consciousness and will. You are creative, resourceful, and whole. You have the capacity to cultivate your creativity, imagination, and intuition. There are different kinds of will and different stages of willing, and every act of will involves all of the psychological functions. Psychological wounding can cause your will to be trapped in unconscious patterns designed to defend you against pain. But cultivating self-awareness can help to release your will from patterns of blame and shame and self-sabotage. The primary tool for this in psychosynthesis is disidentification, which I'll explain in a minute. Every being is a soul on a journey. So every being has a soul and also the survival personality, as we discussed. And there are stages in the process of awakening or spiritual emergence, i.e. the journey of the soul emerging and breaking through the survival personality, which can create crises or emergencies, which is what we were just looking at. The aim of psychosynthesis psychology is to synthesize the psyche around a unifying center so that the will can be effectively aimed, i.e. without an internal conflict. So that takes us back to the egg diagram, which is, if you can remember, the I in the middle is where we're identifying from. So the process of disidentification is about coming back to that center. So when we have moments where perhaps we're stuck in some aspect of our survival personality, where we've become irate perhaps, and we're, projecting something onto somebody else, where we're not necessarily taking responsibility for our experience. They did this to me, maybe we're caught in history through that experience. Disidentification is about taking a moment to breathe, to center, to come back to that place of witnessing presence, that ground of being that we connected to in the meditation, to just acknowledge that is the center of our consciousness and will, and that we have a choice in each moment to identify with that as our center rather than other parts of our psyche, which may be more reactive and defensive. I love this quote. So in a way, this is the whole point. Why would we do this work? To realize our unavoidable responsibility and our wonderful, inspiring opportunity to consciously recreate ourselves and to help to recreate the world. And this takes us to another model, which is called the right relations model. And again, it's pretty simple. It's saying, you know, here's me and here's you. And in between us, as we're relating in the here and now, is a field, is a field of consciousness that we're both bringing stuff into, right? So if this is the field of consciousness that's created between us, in the lower unconscious, both of us are bringing our history and culture. We're bringing our, we call mirrors of the past, our past experiences, which color how we perceive the world and how we perceive the other in front of us. But at the transpersonal level, we're also brought together in one way or another by shared purpose and desired outcome. And so to meet in the here and now, really, in order to be really available to meet in the here and now, we want to be aware of what is it that we're bringing with us from history and culture that might be interrupting or blocking our capacity to actually be present with what's in front of us, whether that's another person or a situation. That essentially a lot of the time we're actually projecting the past onto the present rather than meeting it. So this quote from Maslow, I think, conveys that really well. Only the flexibly creative person can really manage future. Only the one who can face novelty with confidence and without fear. I am convinced that much of what we now call psychology is the study of the tricks we use to avoid the anxiety of absolute novelty by making believe the future will be like the past. So what he's referring to there is something I was talking about at the beginning of the presentation, which is that a lot of psychology is related to the lower unconscious and the ways in which we develop a personality to help us navigate the world based on the past. And that's because it's actually very kind of taxing and difficult to just meet the present. But that's what we need to do if we want to be able to access the superconscious and those qualities of imagination and intuition. So he's saying we're often bringing our mirrors of the past and we're just projecting them onto the present. And those mirrors of the past actually tell us a lot about our psychology, our psychological makeup, our survival personality. And psychosynthesis is helping us to become aware of that so that we can meet reality in the here and now and be open to possibility, be more responsible. So how do we work with this in, coaching? Well, we recognize, okay, we each have this survival personality, these adaptive defense mechanisms and compensation strategies. And we also have this self, this soul that is connected to our emergent gifts and creativity. And this is actually another very simple model in a way from psychosynthesis coaching, which is called trifocal vision, which is about seeing these three dimensions in the person. So working with, okay, someone's coming and they've got their defense mechanisms. They've got their desire that's bringing them into the here and now to create change. And they've got potentially untapped gifts. Yeah. So seeing all of these and working with them to create small steps in order to realize more of this. rather than unconsciously playing out that. And another model, there's so much in here. One of the ways that we would help someone to do that in psychosynthesis, psychology, and in coaching is by helping them to differentiate between what we would call neurotic and existential concerns. So neurotic guilt and shame would be related to the survival personality, and existential guilt and shame is related to self. So what this is saying is that there are different levels at which we engage with life. And some of our concerns are coming from our survival personality. It's about, like I was saying earlier, control, approval, and fitting in. And we would call those neurotic, and they're not necessarily what we want to follow, actually. Now, other concerns are coming from that deeper part of us, that deeper soulful self that's, you know, actually really wanting to be expressed, wanting to be met, wanting to know life more intimately, wanting to experience more deeply. And at that level, we might think, oh, I'm not doing my best here, right? We might have concerns at that level. This isn't really it. There's more to me than this. There's more to life than what I'm living. And so actually, those are existential concerns. And we want to be able to listen to them and identify the difference between these two. Okay, we're on the home straight. So how does this relate to soulful leadership? Which I said at the beginning, it's just about applying this thinking to the times that we're living in. Oh, one of those images is missing. Sorry about that. But a great quote and a simple one from Hetty Einzig, who's a really great psychosynthesis coach. She says, the transpersonal works very deliberately with failure and crisis as opportunities for breakthrough. And so that's kind of the point. When we take the transpersonal perspective, we are aware that there's a relationship between emergence and emergency and breakdown and breakthrough, and we can use those things as opportunities for growth. So, I don't know if you've heard this language of VUCA. It's an acronym that describes that we're living in volatile, complex, uncertain, and ambiguous times. And these conditions of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity create certain psychological needs. And actually, there's a response that can come from our deeper soulful self that helps to meet that need. And there's a soulful quality. So this is my thinking on soulful leadership, about how and why the cultivation of transpersonal or soulful qualities helps us to actually meet the difficult realities of our times. And that's related to just recognizing that, and this is related to the crises of meaning and duality. Meeting reality in all of its complexity and with our spiritual and soulful dimensions means that we are standing in the tragic gap, which is the pain of existence. And this is some terminology from Parker Palmer. And he says the thing is, because it's so painful to be here, what happens is that we go through one or two of these defense mechanisms. One is that we collapse into cynicism. So this is again related to the denial in one of the crises. You know, okay, cynicism, there is no meaning anyway. What's the point in trying, right? Or we fly away in idealism. We can get engaged in irrelevant idealism. This would be related to mystic flight I was talking about earlier. So these are two kind of different responses to this need to hold the existential dimensions of existence, of being connected to kind of the superconscious and the capacity that, like, our human potential, creativity and imagination and everything that we can see is possible, the goodness, the truth, and the beauty at the core of humanity, and then also existing in a world in which there is so much suffering. So how do we reconcile ourselves with that? And these are two of the classic defense mechanisms. And so these are some of my models around soulful leadership, around how when the compass is dictated by the survival personality, and it's about aiming for status and hierarchy and control over and money and approval, there can be these shadow qualities playing out. But when the compass is related to the soulful qualities of cultivating truth and beauty and freedom and love and a sense of, sovereign identity and belonging, then we cultivate these other qualities, and these would be the qualities of soulful leadership. So that takes me to just the final piece, which is, that all of this is applied in my 6-week coaching journey on soulful leadership, which is about how do we cultivate those qualities in order to meet the times of crisis. And it's a 6-week journey which contains both group work and one-to-one sessions. And it's really about helping you to access deeper sources of power, presence, and resilience in order to navigate these VUCA conditions with grace. And that's some of the recommendations, and that is it. So thank you for bearing with. I know that was a lot. And I'm curious if you have questions,